rep, Eric King. This is a city manager appointed committee. So Eric King has confirmed that Sean McFadden will be taking Hans's place as the NLA rep for today's final meeting and recommendation. But Hans, please feel free to go ahead and participate in a discussion since that's needed for continuity, and you've been at all the meetings. And thank you for your participation, both of you.
Great. And the other thing, yeah, welcome, Sean. The other thing that I've neglected was to send minutes out to you all from the last meeting. It's been a while. So anyway, so what we'll do is Kayla and I talked before the meeting, and we'll send out minutes from the last one and minutes from this one in a week or two. And maybe we can get together for just like a 10-minute Zoom to go through the minutes and approve the minutes, if that's okay with everyone. Sound good? Or maybe 5 minutes. Okay. And before we start public comment, I just want to mention to folks, I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint, that we're allotting an hour to this to public comment, and we thought we'd have a lot of people. I don't see all that many people in the lobby right now, but we're going to provide 2 minutes each max, and if you could keep your comments kind of directed towards the proposed Bend Development Code Shelter Code amendments, which is like the topic of this meeting, that would be great. It's a little bit different with the sounding board because it's the city manager appointed to committee to make recommendations. You all are making recommendations to staff and the city manager to craft these code amendments, which will then go to the planning commission. And so it's a lot of technical stuff, but these comments that come in today won't be included as part of the legislative record for the planning commission or the city council adoption process. So if you would like to provide these same comments to planning commission and city council, you should send emails to these 3 addresses. Lots of people have been doing that over the past couple of weeks. And then the planning commission meeting is in the evening on Monday nights, and those agendas are posted online, and that will be January 10th and January 24th is the public hearing. Council we haven't scheduled those yet, but we will soon, just to get placeholders. So with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing. And Kayla, do you want to, are you okay managing the public comment? You're so good at that.
Yep, I am ready for that. I will need, I'm not sure, Juan, are you doing the timer or?
I can do a timer too.
Okay. And currently at the moment, we do not have any callers. So if you are interested in speaking, please raise your hand. If you are calling by a phone number, you will want to hit *9 to raise your hand, and then *6 to unmute yourself. So it looks like we do have one call that just popped up. Charles Hemingway. Charles, I've given you the ability to unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
I am calling to support in its entirety the work that has been done by the sounding board and the incredibly detailed work that's been done to hammer out all the various components and again, to thank Susanna and all the members of the sounding board for the hard work that they've done and the vision that they've shown in putting this forward. It was an incredible amount of work, and whatever out here within the community we can do to support the efforts that you guys have put such hard work into. Just want to let you know that we're looking forward to working with you and getting these implemented and seeing what changes we can make in the lives of those out there who currently are struggling to find an affordable place to live, or even a place to live at all, whether it's in a camp, an RV, a small unit of some sort on a family's property. So again, just to express complete support for the work that's been done. Thank you.
Okay, Susanna and Sounding Board, it looks like we have no more callers.
Okay, well, that was a lot quicker. I do see someone with their hand raised, Kayla. Kelly Wainscoat.
Yep, just popped up. Kelly, I've given you the ability to unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So thanks everybody for coming forward and being involved and using your time and expertise and towards this issue to create some movement in what is keeping us from having enough housing for everybody. So thank you. I come from a background where saying something has to be built to code means I don't want to be involved anymore. That sounds complicated. I built a chicken coop once. So I'm here to say that great work, and embrace the fact that this still needs to go forward. Use this as this is breaking some barriers of, this is these are rules that have always been. These go back a long way. They're rooted in history of how do we keep buildings safe and everything. But really, thank you for, you need to keep going forward with these recommendations and go even further once hopefully they're accepted. Because people like us, we don't have the expertise to push these rules. And so I'm here to just encourage people that understand these regulations are the people that can change them. And the people that don't have enough housing can just kind of raise our hands and say, hey, can you guys change something? Because we don't really understand the ins and outs. We don't understand all of these rules. We might see a video on a tiny house and want to do it, and then we get told you can't. And so just keep looking for ways to put compassion into our rules, which are here to make us safe, but also give everybody a place to live. Thank you.
That was right at 2 minutes. Looks like we have a few others.
That is correct. They all came in at once.
Yeah.
Brian Eckborn, I've given you the ability to unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes.
Hi, this is Jennifer Eichhorn. I'm a bit at a loss and I have several questions. I thought this was going to be an informational session and not just simply an opportunity for public comment. So I have several questions about the proposed changes. For example, how you folks determine the maximum number of rooms per acre. Is there other, besides looking at your website, which describe the types of housing, where is it that I can find information that explains how you reach the decisions that you have? Why is it that you folks decided that allowing these types of communities in residential single neighborhoods is an appropriate option in terms of what other services are going to be provided? If folks need wraparound services, how can this be done in residential single neighborhood, which doesn't have the public transportation options or close proximity to job opportunities? Why is it that with respect to some shelters, it's unclear whether or not there's even a mandatory cessation of a shelter if there's doing any dumping of waste? It looks like it's maybe required for the temporary shelters and potentially absolutely required for hardship shelters. I just have multiple questions about how this was developed and where can I go to get further information about the rationale as opposed to just the text.
Yeah, maybe I could just chime in since we have some extra time probably, but I can loop back with you. Was it Jen Icorn? Or Brian Icorn is what you were coming up as.
Susanna,
Anyway,
I believe it's
yeah.
Jennifer Icorn. She's a member of ABNA.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can, sorry, stop. I can touch base with you. So if you go to the sounding board website, all the old packets and the memos and things like that, that the sounding board evaluated to come up with proposals on the density of the numbers of rooms and things like that are all in there, but I can touch base with you and explain stuff a little bit more. So we've been meeting since April, so there's been a lot of information and looking at peer cities and similar developments elsewhere to come up with those numbers. So I'll stop now.
Our next caller is Leslie Lundberg. Leslie, I've given you the ability to unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes.
Sorry, my technology skills aren't very good. I two questions, and I appreciate this is a complex issue and you guys have been working hard. Was there any representation from law enforcement on the sounding board? Number one. And number two, other cities have struggled, obviously, and done something similar. And I'm not sure of the charter, but they tended to go to ballot for full community input on such a major change. Was consideration given to actually putting this on a ballot and seeking votes?
Does anyone want to? Oh,
No,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to announce the next caller. You guys go ahead.
Okay.
Would you like to move forward, Susanna?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, our next caller, it just says Dunn family. So if you could please introduce yourself, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Jim, and I want to thank you. What's currently going on is the self-destruction of humans, and the city's been supporting that. Are there any proposed recovery beds, any counseling provided for those that are in need?
And I mean, that is the role of the county in this process. The city does not do behavioral health, public health.
So my concern is that we're just going to be in a cluster, a circle of the same behavioral life choices, if you will, which a lot of people are choosing that lifestyle. So a lot of things are choice, whether it's taking drugs or alcohol and the abuse. I'm all for supporting, which I do, supporting the families, the women and the kids that truly need the help. Is there a way of prioritizing the shelters for those that are truly in need rather than those depleting the system? I'd rather devote the dollars to those that are truly under hard times versus those that are choosing a lifestyle.
Do you mind, Susanna, if I just?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to, what this process specifically is that we're doing here today are making changes to our code. We are not building shelters. We are not deciding who goes into a shelter. This is just sort of an administrative process to make something permanent so that we are able to build shelters in the future in areas of our city that need it. So we will not, this is not about making decisions about who gets a shelter and who doesn't get a shelter. This is just a purely administrative process that we're doing today.
All right, it looks like that we have no more callers unless any more pop up. But yeah, we're not showing any
Okay, great. Thanks, Kayla. And I think Leslie jumped off, but I just wanted to address her comment about the law enforcement. So, yeah, we're the police department is part of city staff, city department. So internally, we had meetings with the police department. We every 2 weeks have a internal homelessness task force that kind of gives updates and news. So they saw the code amendments and things. And yeah, so they've been in the loop and provided comments and everything along the way. And then the other thing I think Leslie asked was about whether this would go to a ballot. And I'm not sure about that. So I don't know if that would, Elizabeth, thank you.
Sure, Susanna. So the process for this code amendment is the Sounding Board will be making its recommendation today. This is a proposed amendment and change to our Bend Development Code, which is adopted after consideration and a public hearing by the Planning Commission. They will hold a public hearing, consider the amendments, and make a recommendation to forward the amendments with or without changes to the City Council, who will then also hold a public hearing and adopt these proposed changes, if they decide to do so, by ordinance, which will go into effect 30 days after passage. So it's following the typical process for legislative changes to our Bend Code, which the Bend Development Code is a part of. And so that process does not include typically a referral to the ballot, although there are many different ways under state law for ordinances to be considered. And the process that this one is taking is going through the Planning Commission and the City Council for adoption.
Okay. Any more before we go into business?
Susanna, we did have another call pop in. I didn't know
Okay.
if you wanted to take that call.
Sure.
All right. It looks like the caller is Tony Kolish. Tony, I've given you the ability to unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes. Tony, it sounds like that we can't hear you. It looks like you're unmuted. Let's try one more time. All right, Tony, if you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Looks like we may be having some technical difficulties, Susanna, so we may just want to move forward.
Yeah, we'll just go ahead and move forward. Okay. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen again. Let's see, I'm going to go back to the agenda. Let me do this. So today we're going to go through sort of an overview of the survey results and main themes. We'll have some discussion. We need to follow up with you all on a few things internally that have come up. One is to do with the public improvement standards. So those are the off-site improvements like sidewalks, improvements to alleys, maybe intersection improvements, things like that come up or are required when private development is going into the city. Sometimes developers need to upgrade the infrastructure. So we'll talk about that. That came up a couple meetings ago, and we have some questions to ask you so we can get some input on that from you. And then I'd like to hear about other topics you want to talk about after reviewing the survey results and the comments that have been coming in. And then we'll make recommendations and then talk about next steps moving forward. So, and if you have any questions you want to stop me along the way, go ahead and just unmute and let me know. So main themes in the survey responses. As you know, this was our first time using the story map concept and embedding a survey in there. So we were kind of like learning as we go with this, and it was not a quick and easy survey to take. So I'll just note it's not first up here on my slide, but many people had difficulties negotiating the survey. And we know that we're still learning. We did get 868 responses though. And we've gotten well over, 1,500 comments that I've provided in the appendix to you all. I took out a few of them that were I didn't want to show you. So that had a lot of expletives. But nonetheless, we got a lot of interest in this and a lot of people actually reading the code amendments and thinking about them. So by any measure, I think it worked in some ways, although it was not an easy one to negotiate. As far as hits on the website, I think we had, I didn't get a final count from our person that, maintains the story map site, but we had like 2,000 hits, 2,500 hits or something like that. And then on the Spanish version, about 300. And I can't tell how many people took the Spanish version because it automatically, the program just comes back in English to me. So that's a little glitch in the system, but I will be, I should note that we did go to a planning commission work session, mostly to talk about the survey. I went to a number of meetings and stuff and just showed people a story map and showed them how to go through the survey. And the planning commission asked that maybe we do some targeted outreach towards folks who are houseless and work with the service providers to get maybe not them to do the electronic survey, but maybe do a paper version or something like that. And just, I'll probably be doing that in the next couple of months and bringing that input to the planning commission to make their final decisions on the code amendments. And that showed kind of in the demographics. I sent to you all the memo on Friday. We only had 2 houseless people that identified as houseless actually go through the survey. And it was tough to negotiate on a phone. So we know there's limitations to this, but maybe it's something we can work through in future versions. And I know Esri, who hosts that story map concept, is just doing an update. So we might see some different changes going through. But just overall main themes, people have super strong feelings about providing solutions for people experiencing houselessness. Folks have pretty strong feelings about providing shelters in residential zoning districts. And many respondents felt like they needed additional information, more background on the building and planning codes. It's pretty technical stuff to be asking people. So if they haven't sat through all the meetings or they're not up on land use planning in Oregon, it's can be difficult to negotiate. But I think qualitatively, we did get some good feedback from folks. So I'll just go through main themes. So in general, respondents were supportive of using the building code for determining the occupancy maximums in group shelters. And this was, if you recall, we kind of figured that, most of these group shelters are not going to be in a new building, a nonprofit or a service provider. Just funding and land prices are so limited. This is likely never going to go into a brand new building constructed for homeless folks, unless, there's a big bond measure or something like that, something like that to direct it towards there. So they're probably going to go into an existing building, like a gym, an old school. The Second Street shelter went into an existing building. But people, recommended reducing the maximum number of beds allowed. And that seemed to be pretty straight across in all of the zoning districts. And then increasing the numbers of on-site parking. So parking came up a lot throughout because we asked about it. And it was a big topic of discussion for the sounding board too. And it's funny to look through the comments that came in. And, on one hand, you'd have someone saying, if you look through those bolded ones I sent you in the appendix, there'd be, I don't believe in parking minimums. The service providers can figure it out, or we need to use all buildable space, to house people. And then right after that, it'll be like, are you crazy? There needs to be 3 times as much parking. So it's really a polarizing question. I think across the board where we asked about 0.25 spaces, people felt like that would not be enough, like 0.25 spaces per room, 0.25 spaces per bed, something like that. It was more like people were like, well, I think 0.5 might be a better option, but there were a number of comments too, and I'm just speaking qualitatively, this is not statistically valid or anything, but that's recommended, start somewhere and then tweak it in a few years. If we get a few of these projects and we kind of say, there's too many people parking on the street, there's not enough, there's not enough spaces on site, or there's too many spaces on site, go back and revise that. So that was something that came up a few times. Respondents tended to want fewer rooms for the multi-room shelters. They felt pretty strongly about, prohibiting these in residential districts, and then they tended to want more parking than we were recommending, as I just mentioned. And I think I had a discrepancy in some of the descriptions, the written descriptions, and what we asked questions on. And so there was some confusion on that. So that's my bad. And then, several commenters recommended reevaluating parking after implementation. So I think people are thinking if we do the multi-room shelters, which we will, we are doing already with Project Turnkey, the Bethlehem is a example, maybe make caps on the number of rooms. That could be a solution. So I think the concept of having 248 rooms, I saw in a few comments, was like, whoa, that's a lot of rooms. So, we could talk about that if the sounding board's interested in dialing that back at all. For outdoor shelters, about 18% of people were supportive of the 1 unit per 1,000 square foot formula. Some recommended a maximum because they thought like 43 sites would be a lot to manage. About 66% of the respondents disagreed or strongly disagreed with the formula and recommended caps or not allowing these in residential zoning districts at all. And folks generally wanted more on-site parking to prevent overflow into the neighborhoods. And I should step back and say, in the memo I sent and that's posted online, we only had 2 folks that were houseless. Most of the people that answered the survey were identified themselves as being from the northwest quadrant of the city. The income level was between 75,000 and 150,000. That's the most of the people that answered the survey identified with that, and most were white. So we definitely, the folks that took the time to go through the survey tended to be a certain demographic, and it was pretty equal male versus female. But, the folks, we got so many disagree and strongly disagree, and I think it's because of those demographics that took the survey. So I just wanted to note that. So I tried to pull out both pros and cons from the results we got. But most of them obviously are, and this is a really emotional, people have strong opinions about houselessness and how we provide for our houseless folks and everything in our community. So people are pretty fired up in the comments. So that could be why we didn't have a representative sample of the entire city is what I'm trying to say, I guess. So anyhow, let me go back, sorry. And then for hardship shelters, this has been a big point of contention with folks, and about 20% of folks were in favor of using hardship shelters and agreed with the time limit and the renewal period. And then about 80% were not in support of the hardship shelters. I think in a lot of the comments I read, people would support them if there was less of a time period for them. I've checked into Portland. They just have been allowing these RVs and driveways just as of August 1st. So they don't have a ton of data on this yet, but we'll be in talks in the next month or so because they're just pulling together some initial data on how things are going, and they have no time limit. There's no expiration in their ordinance. So I think that's interesting. many kind of wanted to shorten that time frame that these would be allowed. And they brought up also that enforcement and regulation of these would be difficult. So these are something we're going to follow up on in the next couple slides. We'll talk about a few things that we talked to our code enforcement officer about. So yeah, additional items. Well, before we do that, does any of the sounding board have any questions on what I just went over? Or comments? No. Brianna, great.
So many buttons to hit, sorry.
I know. I hear ya.
I was just curious if I know you touched on it a little bit as far as the survey and identifying some of the challenges with that, but has there been further discussion? I think the demographic sort of summary that you just provided is really interesting. And how do we capture the rest of who is in our city? And I think that's vital information to inform, decisions that get made going forward.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I wish Anne, our communications director, was on this, or somebody from communications. But the only way really to get kind of that representative sample that I know of is to consult with like a DHM consultants or something, a public opinion and research firm, to do, a statistically valid survey that's representative of our demographics. So every 2 years we do the community survey, and it's we ask the same questions every year. DHM has managed it the last, I think 5 times or something, 4 times. So we get a good baseline. And the last time we did it was not this last year. It might have been this last year, actually, or maybe the year before, maybe Barb or Megan, you remember, but homelessness and housing never came up. I mean, housing did, affordable housing would come up as a key point, but this last time they did it, homelessness was like number 2 as a community concern. So it's right, which is kind of like why council has taken this step, really, because it is a huge concern to our community. So it would be interesting to do some statistically valid research. We wouldn't be able to ask as many questions on the code stuff, but it would be kind of interesting to get a more representative sample of folks in the future.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you. So
I was just going to say, I know you haven't, this is still sort of in the city circle, but can you tell us about the feedback that you've gotten from presenting at other city committees and commissions? That might help broaden it a little bit.
I haven't gotten a lot of feedback yet, to be honest, because mostly we've been focusing on, this is how the story map works, and this is the amendments, and this is how you work the survey. Mm-hmm. So Sean and Hans, you were at the NLA when I went. Brianna, you were at the BUDAB advocacy subcommittee. They had a lot of questions, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I also think that group were in that demographic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, and I think that's why it's so interesting. I mean, there's this huge, I don't know what to call it, but it's like this 2 pictures of and who lives here, right? And what has been historically always been, and what are we going to be, and what does that transition look like, and how do we make sure we capture all of those people? Mm-hmm. Even in the survey where homelessness was the number 1 concern, in the back of my mind, I'm wondering if it was the number 1 concern because they were seeing it, like which has also been a huge thing lately, is that it's really visible now, whereas in the past it has not been. So was it the same people responding, just not you could take that, yes, it's a concern, but what is your concern with it? That it exists, or that you're trying to solve it? And so I think all of those things together are speak a lot. And the reason that demographic speaks up is because we have the tools and the resources to do so, right? And so how do you capture the rest of it?
I was looking back at my notes from the Human Rights and Equity Commission, because Susanna, you weren't able to present, right? Was that Shelley that did it?
No, I did. I gave a
did, yeah.
quick overview. Yeah.
I mean, that was different feedback.
Yeah.
For sure. I
That's
wish
right.
our representative was here today. Actually.
Yeah, I think they asked about, yeah, Mo brought up a really good point that it is a really complicated survey. And so, who's spending the time taking it and trying to understand it. And I think that's a really valid point. It's really hard to explain planning, zoning, development code, blah, blah, like who wants to understand all that except us, so that can prohibit people from taking it, so yeah. Hans?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that historically, the city's been a little reticent to put too much stock in non-statistically valid surveys, and I get that. And there's factually the people that have access and time, there will be underrepresented groups. I think that's factual. That's hard to argue against. I mean, the numbers do show that those that did respond, the largest age group was 35 to 54. But what do you draw from that? Not much. And also, I think it's important that the public appreciate that we are, as Councilor Perkins said, we are talking about code issues. We're not getting into moralities or value statements. We're talking about code issues. And I would venture to say I didn't read anywhere near all the comments, but I read enough comments, and I don't think it's such a broad brush to say that perhaps half of the comments were opposed to the concept and weren't really speaking to our work here on codes. So all that being said, I would just caution us not to be even a little bit dismissive, because I think there's enough data there to say that, yes, this is a passionate issue, but I think dissecting it is challenging. And that's where I think we need to not dismiss the people that are, just philosophically opposed to having shelters in residential areas. That's a fact. People feel that way. We get that. And maybe more outreach at the right time in the right way will let people have more of a voice and more access to something other than, a laptop or a telephone. But at the same time, while there is some really, really strong opinions about, and I, of course, the NIMBY conversation is going to come up, but, the fact that it was mostly homeowners, mostly people that, have higher incomes. I mean, that doesn't mean that their inputs aren't valuable, but I think we do need to put some effort into reaching out to other groups. And maybe it's not, a survey that requires a phone or a laptop, but so, I mean, the data is real, but to parse it out is really challenging. And I think one of the things we can do to get this into bite-sized pieces is focus on the comments that were useful and spoke to code and real work we're trying to do here, because that's what we're here to do, not try to decide whether or not there should or shouldn't be shelters or whether should or shouldn't be social systems. That's not our goal here. That's just not our reason for being.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Barb?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Hans. That was a really excellent comment. Yeah, I would, Susanna, did we ask working or retired on the survey? Did we find that out?
I'd have to look. I think we did.
Okay.
No, maybe not. No, because I don't remember that. I'll check and get back to you. One thing I think we should have asked too is, do you consider yourself a social service provider or something like that? Do you work in this world? So yeah.
I was thinking about that income level and the age group that it sounds like most of the respondents were between, I thought you said between 70 something thousand and 100 and some thousand. And most folks were between 30 something and 50 something. To me, I think that's telling. That income level is what it takes to survive in Bend. That income level is barely able to afford a home, quite frankly. Some of our affordable housing is available all the way up to 110% of our median income. So it seems to me that income level, that age level, this is telling us that these are people who are working and they're making enough money to live in Bend. But, you know, I'm imagining that these are exactly the people for whom their home is their biggest investment of their life. And of course, they are worried about their neighborhood and what's going to happen in their neighborhood. And that's exactly why we started this work, is right now, things are entirely uncertain. People just have no idea what could happen because the state has said anything can happen. The state passed a bill that's been referred to as the super citing bill, meaning you can cite housing anywhere for anyone. And we did not want to continue to go forward with that as the playing field. That has created so much anxiety in our community. And I completely understand it. My home's my biggest investment as well. And we're trying to relieve that anxiety. So the state has said anything, anywhere. And we started this work to put sideboards on that so that people can have some idea about if there's an empty lot in their neighborhood, if there's a building they drive by, if there, you know, what could happen there. And that answer of we don't know, it could be anything, is just not a good answer. That is just freaking people out. And that's why we have started working on these code changes. And it's impossible to imagine, you know, it's so hard to imagine something you've never seen. And, you know, we don't have many examples here in Bend where we can say, well, this is like this thing, and this is like this other thing. Many of us on this sounding board have seen successful examples of communities for formerly homeless folks that have been successful in Portland and Eugene. And that is why I believe that, yes, you know, these things can work. So I just wanted to say that. And then the other thing I wanted to say is we're still within 10 minutes of what the agenda said was public comments. So I just wanted to check in another time, say to people, go ahead and raise your hands. You know, if anybody thought that they'd be able to make public comment at 10 till 10, you know, I would very much say, you know, we're still going to listen to those. So just thanks to everyone who took the survey. It was complicated. Code changes are always complicated. For me, that's why, no, this just is not something that would work as a ballot measure. Ballot measures have to be a single issue, a single question that can be expressed as a yes or a no. And, you know, we are looking at changes for 4 different types of housing. So, you know, I do think that's it's always a good suggestion. As far as I'm concerned, you know, that might be, you know, always top of mind is, should we be figuring out this puzzle in a different way? But, you know, for me, no, ballots just would not work for this. And that's why we've been doing this work here in the sounding board. And then after this, it will go to Planning Commission. As Susanna said at the beginning of public comment, people still have the opportunity to send an email to Planning Commission and then to City Council. After Planning Commission takes a look, if they will, those recommendations will go to Council. So there are still many opportunities to make public comments to shape what these code amendments will actually be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barb, for pointing out the public comment. We do have somebody, we had 2, I thought, that that had their hand raised in the lobby. So yeah, thanks. Hans, do you want to go? And then we can go over to public comment.
Thanks. I'll keep it brief.
Yeah.
Couple more comments just for the audience and for our benefit as well. There is a possibility that those people within the city that took the survey and have, for lack of a better word, protection in their mind because they have HOA, CCNRs that preclude these things, that may or may not be a factor. The specific number between that age group of 35 and 54 was 36%. So it wasn't a majority, but that was the largest represented group, 35 to 54. Kind of a sidebar to Barb's comments. Because we are proposing some specific things, I think the value in this is now we have some very specific things we can speak to. We went from very, very vague and broad to, okay, now we're talking about how many beds, how many per acre, how many parking spaces. That is tremendous progress to now we've basically funneled this down to some really good talking points that the public can talk to us about. And I think we all recognize, and I think that the public has a tendency, at least the alarmed public, and perhaps a bad choice of words, but there is this tendency to go to the worst case, always the worst case scenario. It could be this many beds with this small number of parking spaces, and before you know it, we've lost the value of having some really constructive dialogue. There is ultimately a number that can be calculated, and that is the worst case, but that doesn't mean that everything is worst case. And I think if we can focus the public's support and the public's input to these sorts of specific things that we're discussing, as opposed to the philosophical arguments, I think we have a real opportunity in front of us as long as we can keep the dialogue focused on the codes and the metrics. And to Barb's point, one can go to the comprehensive plan. One can find out what can be built there. And once you know what can be built there and you understand the codes when they're passed for these shelters, you can specifically understand what kind of shelter may or may not be built in that piece of dirt across the street from you. So there is a path, and it can be, on occasion, it can be difficult to navigate, but the public should know that there is a way to be specific once these things are passed and understand, and then speak to the specifics, not to the worst case or the imagination. And I know that was long and I said I'd be brief, so apologies.
Okay, why don't we go to, thanks for all that folks. So why don't we go to Tony Kolish? See you in the lobby. I'm giving you the ability to unmute. Okay, go ahead. You have 2 minutes. Tony? Are you there? No, I guess not. Okay. Well, your hand is still up, but did you want to say something? Okay, I'm gonna.
Yeah, Susanna, I think he's having some technical issues. So.
Okay, all right. Okay, anyone else? Would anyone else like to make public comment?
Saw another hand up earlier. I think it was Kathy, but
Yeah,
Kathy,
I did too. Kathy Roche.
Kathy, I've given you the ability to unmute.
I'm sorry, I was just testing. I'm listening in today and I was just testing to see if I knew how to raise my hand because it's not very obvious on the screen. I apologize for wasting your time.
No, it's okay. Don't worry.
All right, let's see. Let's try MJ. MJ, actually it looks like MJ, I need to promote you to a panelist to, there you are. MJ, you can unmute yourself and share your comment.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you to Barb Campbell for pointing out that for many homeowners, this is the biggest investment of their life. And so that's why there is anxiety among many people. For somebody who's a millionaire, perhaps not an issue, but for someone who has worked steadily and has made sacrifices for their home, it is a huge issue as to quality of life and what their residential neighborhood looks like and the safety of the neighborhood. So I appreciate that Barb recognized that. I also wanted to comment that I like the idea of reevaluating after implementation of some of these ideas to make adjustments as needed. I think that's an important step as well. Thank you.
All right. It looks like we have Brad Irwin. Brad, I've given you the ability to unmute yourself. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Brad Irwin, and I am a 40-year resident and have participated in the city of Bend. I'm also an employer, and I recognize that what this committee is suggesting is permanent changes that affect the city that we have all worked hard, including this committee, to build, and for years and years and years. And this is a very scary change for the people who have built this. And it seems to me that it's moving really, really quickly. One of the participants in this conversation that I don't feel is being represented is the businesses. And I employ 21 people, and I strive to get those 21 people to be in that $75,000 to $150,000 range. That's my goal. And where I'm located, we are very affected by this, and it's a big deal. I also hope that the committee recognizes, it sounds like the survey gave you some results, and it sounds like 66% of the people either disagreed or strongly disagreed with the direction that we're headed. And then I heard a discussion about, well, let's go find more people. And everybody should be represented, absolutely. But it sounded like you've got to find a lot of people to agree with it to move 66% to 45% or whatever target you're striving for. So please, I appreciate everybody's effort. And I am part of the conversation. And I hope that the business community is represented as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Susanna, we have one more caller, but it's, I believe, Jim Dunn. I don't know if you want to allow him to speak again, or how would you like me to move forward with that?
I guess go ahead.
Before we do that, could I just respond to,
Sure.
okay. So I just wanted to say, as part of this sounding board and also my role on BDAB, it is about listening to the business community. I am also an owner in an architecture firm. We have 15 employees and continuing to grow. I've been a resident here for over 15 years, as well as the owner that I'm a partner with in this business has been here his entire life, born and raised. So I think the business community is representative. I'm always trying to listen to both sides, and I didn't want to misconstrue my comment on finding more people or finding the other side. I just wanted to make sure that both sides of the story were heard, is all that I meant by the demographics, and the majority being one specific demographic, and making sure that we're hearing all sides. So just wanted to clarify.
All right, so Jim, I'm going to give you the ability to unmute again.
Thank you. I'll keep this brief. I just want to thank Barb for her great framing up and empathizing with all sides and your work. I thought that was very well done. And I think that would be a great way to lead in for those that may have a negative vibe for this. As you said, it's an emotional. So I think Barb did a great job in that. But I do think we do have a good example, and that's Bethlehem Inn, where we're a major donor and participate with them on a weekly basis. And I think that is a good example. And if we present Bethlehem Inn as the flagship, then I think you would see a different feeling throughout the community. And I think, Hans, your point about not in my backyard, I think we can all look in the mirror and ask what we would want in our backyard. And if you cannot say that it is appropriate for your neighbor, then we should go a different direction. Thank you.
All right, we have no more callers.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kayla. Okay, so let's go back to, I also, I didn't mean to send out a 3-hour meeting agenda with no break in it. So if we could, maybe we could take a break at, if folks need it in like half an hour, 10:30-ish, 10:40. Or unless you want to do it now before we dig in again. No. Okay, let's do it later. Okay, so let's get back to, let's see. Okay, so as I said, we had additional items because we had, some internal folks on staff review all the code amendments. We sent them around and we've been having some internal discussions. So one of the ones we had was with our code enforcement officer. So, let's see, in talking with him, he recommended that we add a section to the enforcement section. I might call on Pauline to help me with this one, but just as far to give a little more discretion to code enforcement or the planning director or designee to visit and inspect the site if there are complaints. We have that in different sections of our code with different businesses as well. And it just is another fallback if we're getting complaints about a site. It allows an official to go in and inspect and truth check those complaints and things. Pauline, did you want to talk any more about that?
I just wanted to let the board know that this particular provision also applies currently in our development code to home businesses. So that's where this example comes from. And like Susanna said, working with our code enforcement officer, he thought it might be a good idea to include this for just these two particular types of temporary shelters.
Barb, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, I think the term is evicting. So we could immediately revoke the entire permit. And would that mean that, yes, we could, without, like, if you're in an apartment, you have to have 30 days. But what kind of timeline would it be if there were a single individual that needed to be evicted and or the permit was immediately revoked?
I can try and answer this one for you, Councilor Campbell. Hi.
Thank you.
So, the question of, do you have authority from the city to operate your use? That would be what the permit is about, is a separate question from, are there any rights or are there any rules about evicting the person who is staying on the property? And they can overlap. The landlord tenant code talks about if a building, for example, is red tagged or because it's just too dangerous for anyone to be in, right? So the operator of a shelter would have to be aware of any other state laws or other regulations that would apply to how they need to treat the guests or the folks who are staying there and what their responsibilities might be in the event a permit was revoked. But it's sort of two separate legal questions. What happens to the people who are staying there once the permit is revoked? But if the permit is revoked, there would be no longer permission under the city code for the use to continue.
And then what about if it were not a case where the permit, I'll go ahead and ask that right now, Elizabeth, while I've got you. What if it were a single individual and that individual had broken the rules, had broken the law, but, for some reason needed to be removed?
So if there's not a landlord-tenant relationship, that could potentially be a case of somebody no longer has permission to be on private property and could be trespassed.
There we go.
So, yeah.
I thought that it's more like if you have a guest in your home, if your father-in-law starts to be too problematic, you can just kick him out without having to give him a month's notice. It's kind of
That's
like
right.
that, right?
If you're in that type of situation, and then yes, it could just be as simple as trespassing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Barb, just to add to that, under the violations, we did use the word may with the intent of probably working with let's say it's an RV on the hardship shelter, and maybe their electrical isn't hooked up right, or their sewer. We will, with every good intention, work with the hardship shelter, and that's why we use the word may.
Of course. Thank you so much. And that's exactly what I would expect, code violation, little, yes, thank you.
Okay, and then, so did that provide clarity a little bit on that? And we'll take a vote on this, I guess, when we get down to recommendations from the sounding board. But those are two provisions that we wanted to add to those two different shelter types. And the other item was on the second column, temporary shelters. We had a lot of, kind of controversy over the temporary shelters and why we didn't ask about them in the survey. And in our mind, temporary shelters are, and we tried to explain this, there was a bulletin editorial, and then we've gotten a lot of, emails about this, that we were being deceitful and not explaining things properly. But the temporary shelters are something that we authorize under our emergency orders on a regular basis. And they've gotten so regular that they're not really emergencies anymore. And those are things like excessive smoke, heat, and then cold too. We used to, I think Eric had to do it again this year to do a temporary emergency order for the warming shelter. And so because we were doing these code amendments, I think the sounding board would recall, we had a quick, it was like nothing to, we had a quick conversation about authorizing the temporary shelters for a period of 180 days. And just to take it out of the emergency order process, because sometimes, city manager might be on vacation, they've got a designee in place, and that person's busy, or the city council meeting doesn't fall on a date where we might have air quality of 420 or something like that. And so it just seemed like a good thing to provide this in these set of code amendments. Elizabeth, do you want to say any more on that? And not have the church or the provider that wants to offer this have to go through a land use permit review. That would just be slow. We've done this the last few summers with the Ben Church and other places, First Presbyterian and things, to have smoke shelters and stuff. So Elizabeth, any more?
No, I think you covered it. Like Susanna said, we have this emergency declaration process that allows the city manager to declare an emergency and waive certain code provisions, which is how those shelters that Susanna talked about have been established in the past, the smoke shelter or a cold shelter or heat shelter even. And like she said, this is to put into the code that allowance for temporary shelters to have a set code of what they do have to meet, rather than using an emergency order to say, you don't have to meet, whatever we tell you, you don't have to meet. This sort of clarifies the expectations for a temporary shelter and puts it into the code so that it is there all the time for folks to look at and say, what are the requirements for opening up a shelter on a temporary basis? And the intent is to have the allowance there so it is clear and available for anyone to look at any time about what are the requirements to open a shelter for a short-term use of 180 days. And I see Hans has his hand up.
I do have a process question. Thank you, Elizabeth. In reading the comments, a number of the respondents were concerned about the time frame for a hardship, i.e. RV in a driveway. So that's a specific that we can speak to, and it may be in subsequent slides, Susanna, so apologies. But from a process point of view, Will we try to address that, or will we leave that as an open question for later discussion in hearings? But I think that's a specific that at some point in time, whether it's today or in the future, we want to try and reconcile the concern about that time frame, the 1 year, 6 months renewals. I think that's something we probably want to speak to.
Yeah, that's a great point. We could do it. I mean, I think, Elizabeth, would it be better to do all the recommendations to the changes at the end, or kind of as we're going through the slide?
I think your next slide are there any changes the sounding board wants to talk about in response to some of the comments received on the survey? So I think we set up this question because this was a question that came up from staff review, as well as kind of thinking about the comments received. And then I think we'll get to exactly your point, Hans. Are there any other changes the sounding board wants to talk about or make in response to comments received, or for any other reason?
Yeah, so we'll go through this and discuss, and then go through our next one on the public improvement standards and have some questions for you. And then we'll kind of open it up for anything else, you know, we should be talking about today in our recommendations. So the other, let's see, so in light of kind of the controversy and stuff over the temporary shelters, you could make a recommendation that these type of temporary shelters, and again, they're only good for 180 days, so would be only permitted in residential zones if they were associated with an institutional or public use. So if you were in a commercial, light industrial, any of the other zones, you wouldn't have to meet this. But in light of kind of the controversy that this brought up, we thought this could be a solution. So we have a lot of churches, schools in residential zoning districts. And so if a shelter, a temporary shelter for smoke, for heat, whatever was going to go in, it would be for 180 days, and it would need to be associated with an institutional or public use, like a church or a school, something like that. So we thought that could be maybe relieve some of the concern that people have over this. Kathy, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, everyone has to do that once in Zoom, right? I just wanted to say that I think this is why we reach out to others, because we are a limited amount of people in our group. We can't think of everything. And I think all of these recommendations are very sound and make a lot of sense. And I would be supportive of making these changes personally, or adding them, I suppose. It's not really a change, but I think they all make sense personally.
Okay, thanks. And then just to clarify too, the temporary shelter that we're talking about is for things that aren't so much emergencies anymore. Like I said, they happen pretty consistently. We get cold, we get heat, we get fire, we get all kinds of stuff. But if there was a true emergency, like there's a fire, you know, and we have to evacuate 300 people or something like that, that would still go through an emergency order. And that's probably going to go wherever we can find room for people. And I would hope that neighbors would understand that, and that's kind of a different situation altogether. And that would still go through an emergency order by the city manager, if that makes sense. So they may go in a residential district and all bets are off for that. You know, that's going to be like a safety of the community type thing, or if there's a massive earthquake or something like that, you know, if that makes sense. So this is for things that kind of happen that we need space for people on a temporary basis, but it's more of a regular situation, if that makes sense. And the other thing that our code enforcement officer kind of recommended for the temporary and the hardship, we had different timelines as far as like after your permit is done, you have 90 days to revoke. I think we have that in there for the temporary shelter, and then only 30 for the hardship, or I might be messing it up and I don't have the code up, but he just recommended we make it consistent. And so we're recommending that for both of those. that the improvements need to be removed within 30 days of the permit expiration, if that makes sense. Okay. So then the next recommendation we have, and I think I'm going to defer to Colin to explain this. I think he's on. Hey there, Colin. The next recommendation we have is on public improvement standards, or we need a little guidance from you. Let me just pull up. Pauline, is Colin on the call? No, I don't see him.
He might be, but I can help.
Okay.
Looks like he's an attendee right now.
Okay, let me pull him. No, he's not
no.
there.
Yeah, he raised his hand as an attendee.
Oh, there he is. Okay. Sorry.
I just promoted him to a
Oh, thanks.
panelist.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. All right. So Colin, when you're ready, or Pauline. So we had a couple of things, items on this, as far as, public improvements required when either a minimum development standards application comes in or a site plan application. So now I'm going to defer to Colleen or Pauline to explain all this.
All right. Well, thanks, Susanna, and thanks everybody for your attention. I think I know most people, but if you don't know me, I'm Colin Stevens. I manage the planning division for the city. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the existing code and sort of the rules that are followed today. And then we may bounce it around through other staff members when we talk about the options, which are on the right-hand side of this slide. But under today's code, there's really, three processes I want to talk about for when development comes in. And this kind of applies across the board, and then we can talk more specifically about how this would apply to the shelter option. So we have what's called a minimum development standards review, and that applies to existing buildings, existing developed sites. And that's where there's either a change of use, so it goes from like a retail to a restaurant, or if there is an expansion of an existing use that is under 5,000 square feet in size. And then there's two tracks that a minimum development standards review would take. If it's let's just say it's a change of use. So if one of the shelter types wanted to go into an existing building, it would trigger MDS. And so the planner working on it would look to see if the MDS is exempt. And what minimum development standards does, what the application is intended to do, is it's right out of the name. It's to ensure that there are a minimum level of development standards that exist on the site. And those are generally related to things like bicycle parking. Is the trash screened? If it's an expansion of a use, that if new parking is necessary to meet the new demand because the use grew. And if all of the elements of all the minimum development standards that we would look at are all present on the site, like if it was a relatively modern building and all that stuff was there, it exempts out. So all you do, the planner would look, it's exempt, and then it just goes to building permit. Now, if there were some deficiencies, so that second bullet down, there are some deficiencies. Say you needed to put in some bike parking. But this would apply. The second bullet would apply if it's residential for sidewalks and alley improvements, but that wouldn't apply in commercial. There would actually be some improvements needed on the site, and that would go through what's called a full-blown MDS, where we would create basically a land use or planning file number, work with the applicant to get the site up to meet the minimum development standards, and that would be in conjunction with pulling the building permit to do whatever internal types of things need to happen in there. And the third bullet, there's no transportation facility report for an MDS. And if it does go to an MDS, it's what's called a type 1 application. It's pretty simple. We usually kick them out within 30 days. And there's no notice or opportunity for appeal for surrounding property owners. Now, the big difference between that and the next bullet is it goes from a type 1 to a type 2 process. And this would really only occur if it's new construction. So if it's a new building or a new use, which is important, but if it's a new building, it goes through what's called site plan review, or if it's a massive, larger than 5,000 square foot addition onto an existing building, it would have to go through site plan review. And this is where there's notice to neighbors. There's more standards that need to be met to bring the site up to meet the code requirements. There's sewer and water analysis that would be necessary. There would be a transportation facility report. And what that is that is a snapshot of what the site looks like, and the general surrounding area. And it's sort of an inventory of what if there's any existing driveway approach, if there's any existing sidewalks, just to let the reviewers understand exactly what's going on around the site as far as transportation, potential improvements, frontage improvements. There's also some trip distribution. They would have to show where the trips are going to distribute on and off the site, but that's kind of it. And there may be some conditions of approval that are derived from that. A full-blown transportation impact analysis, that's where the transportation engineer would have to look out at impacts to intersections that are impacted by the development. That doesn't kick in until there's 700 average daily trips. And that's a fairly significant number of trips. A good way to illustrate what that would be, and that's vehicle trips too, we don't count alternative mode trips and pedestrian trips. So that would be vehicle trips. A typical single family dwelling is about 10 ADT. So if to compare that to what we would see at a development, that would be like a 70 lot new subdivision. So that's quite a number of trips that I doubt any of these would actually trigger, but you never know if there's something of that kind of scale. Okay, I'm going to pause there and ask if there's any questions. Looks like.
Hi, Colin. If I could ask a question. Hi, thank you for that. So if they are not required to do the transportation, and it's only doing the transportation analysis that we would find out if there were more than 700 trips?
Yeah, I mean, we could probably scope it out with the developer beforehand. We have our engineering staff is fairly up to speed on this, and they can go, and if we understand what the uses are in the building, we could go to what's called the ITE manual, which is the International Transportation Engineers Manual, and we could probably, just say if it's number of units, building size, there's a number of ways that they study it, but it's an average that this group of Institute of Engineers has determined is an average number of trips, and it's based on use. So you could pretty well figure it out just scoping it with the staff. You wouldn't necessarily need to involve a transportation engineer in that, unless it was something really out of the ordinary.
Okay.
Hey, Colin, I had a quick question. Sorry, I had to grab my power cord or else I was going to get kicked out here. And I was wondering about the change of use. So if, let's say a current house is a fourplex or something like that, and it wants to change to one of these multi-room houses, is that considered a change of use?
In the residential district? Yeah, I mean, if it's listed out as, yeah, that would be considered a change of use to go from a 4-dwelling residential unit to a multiple, to I guess, the temporary housing.
Yeah, because I just wonder about some of these that they'll essentially be kind of the same. It's just it's a different use, but it's almost the same building or the same basic kind of thing. It's not a ground up new construction. If so, would that trigger some of the improvement standards?
Potentially. I mean, it's so like when I talked about it in my original explanation. So going from like retail to a restaurant, it could happen within the same building without doing any kind of a expansion, but we would consider that to be a change of use because there's probably going to be some fairly substantial tenant improvements to make it go from retail to a restaurant. And certainly there would be additional impacts, usually sewer and water and trips, and we actually require more parking for something like that. So that's where we analyze what that delta would be, and then try to bring the site up to meet those minimum standards in order to accommodate that change of use. Now,
If I can add to that,
oh, go ahead.
Colin, sorry, in the draft, the change of use is triggered when an expansion of an outdoor or a change of building that increases demand on public facilities or requires new additional parking stalls. So that's what we would look at. So if it's going from, I don't know, a 2-bedroom to a 4-bedroom, will we look at that being an increase on public facilities or parking? If the answer is yes, then it would probably be MDS. If the answer is no, then they would not go through MDS.
Okay, so some of these like motels that might be converted, it seems like there wouldn't be an increased demand on plumbing counts or anything, or parking, so that wouldn't generally trigger. I guess I'm just trying to balance, like, I would hate to have some public improvement standards that may not be necessary, cause a hindrance or a barrier to the development of it. But then it's, it also, on the other side, you don't want it to just be a free-for-all of, well, this type of use doesn't have to pay for anything, so everyone else has to make up for it, kind of thing.
Yeah, and we met as staff and we talked about it as well. And I think one of the biggest sort of balance points that we might try to accomplish or try to hit the sweet spot on is sidewalks. Because a lot of times the MDS will trigger sidewalks, especially in these older buildings, which can be a cost for these projects, which they usually don't have a lot of excess money for doing site improvements. But then we have to balance that with the fact that sidewalks are pretty important for these types of uses to get people out of the streets. They're not walking on dirt paths or trails that are that they actually are able to come and go with some degree of safety and dignity. And so I think that's something to think about.
Kathy's had her hand up for a while, so I want to make sure we get to her. But yeah, all good discussion.
Well, thank you. I was wondering if we could put the slide back up because I had basically a question, and that is, are you recommending that a different process based on the slide? Just see, so about the options to consider. My concern has to do with time and going through a lengthy process through planning when there's an emergency situation for some of our shelters is a negative. I mean, I grant that we don't want it to be a free-for-all, as Scott said, but at the same time, we don't want to get bogged down in a process that isn't really necessary for this specific type of project. But I do appreciate what Colin was saying about sidewalks. I've been involved in projects where we've provided an asphalt pathway instead as a temporary solution if it's in a rural sort of situation. So if there's options that allow an alternative compliance that isn't as expensive, that would be something to consider as well. So could you just explain what the proposal is under the options to consider?
Well, I can kick that off, and then if other staff members want to join in as well. First, before I do that, I sort of skipped over the third main bullet on the left, and that is what's called a development agreement. And that's what's called a statutory development agreement. This is an option that we kind of talked about as staff that may be available to, or it would be available. It's just whether or not people would want to take advantage of it, but it is authorized out of the state statutes. We have a section in our code that talks about it, but it's kind of a unique off-ramp for unique types of development that, as we were talking about in drafting this code, it's very difficult for us to predict what each individual site is going to look like. And we're trying to, sort of thread the needle and try to cover potentially all problems that we would have on sites when we don't really know, is there a pressure ridge in the right of way that they may need to deal with, or is there some off-site sidewalk that needs to be constructed to get to the site that maybe could be deferred for a year, or it could be an asphalt path instead of a concrete path. So there is this process that a project could apply for, and essentially what it is that you go with your proposal, you negotiate it. There's some structure in the statute that you need to go through some certain steps, but you can essentially use that as your land use decision and not rely upon the standards in the code. The sort of downside, and Kathy, this gets to what you were talking about, is that it takes a while to sort of figure out all the details on that. And you have to go to the city council and have a public hearing, and they have to adopt it. And it's called a statutory development agreement. Just wanted the group to be familiar with that, because that is a vehicle where a unique circumstance that has support from the city council can become a viable land use decision, a project with a land use decision that does not have to follow the sort of the letter of the code. All right, any questions about that before we move on to the right-hand side of the slide?
Well, I'll just jump in, Colin, as well. And I think to answer your question, Kathy, about what this conversation is about, sort of, we've talked a lot about what public improvements might be required, and we thought it would be really helpful to have Colin come as an expert and tell us what is our existing process, and answer the question of what happens if you're going from a commercial building to a shelter? What happens if you're expanding an existing building to a shelter? What happens if you're building something where nothing has existed before? And those are what Colin just outlined, right? And it's not until you get to a brand new building, adding more than 700 trips into the system, that you get into a full-blown, what are our impacts on surrounding intersections and the transportation system as a whole. At that change of use stage, you could be looking at, do we need a sidewalk? Do we need additional bike parking to bring our use up to the standards in the code? And so because there'd been questions about what do we want to require for these types of uses, we thought it would be helpful to say, here's what the code would require today. And then on the right side, which we'll jump to now, is some of our thinking based on your previous discussions about these types of issues, some of our thinking for the options that you could have if you don't think the existing options in the code get to where you all want to be for these uses, for those public improvements of the types we're talking about.
And to follow along on that, just to be clear, because I didn't cover this earlier, is the one sort of new use that we talked about as a staff that I wanted to bring this group up to speed about, that would not be eligible for an MDS under the existing code, would be the siting of, say, a managed camp on a property that has never had any development approval on it before, because that under our code would be considered a new use, and new uses don't qualify for MDS. So we may, that may be one of the places where we focus. If it's going to be a managed camp on a vacant site, we want to do something other than a full-blown site plan review. Okay, so I'll kick off bullets on the right-hand side. So
sorry, Colin, it looks like
there's a bunch of hands up, but I'm not sure if, yeah.
It's so tiny on my screen, I couldn't see it.
I know, it's so hard to see. I see Kathy, Pauline, and Brianna. Kathy, go ahead. Or Pauline, if you had something really quick to say.
No, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. My apologies.
Okay, great. Okay, Pauline.
I forgot to lower my hand too, but just as a reminder to the group, because I was looking through the draft, when we talk about improvements, remember that the shelters are, regardless of what process they go through, are exempt from the landscaping, multimodal access and circulation improvements. And we also spoke about required parking areas, aisles, turnarounds are exempt from paving standards. So we've already added, even if they have to go through maybe a site plan review application, some exemptions so they're not triggered to put in all these on-site improvements.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, Kathy or Brianna, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna, and actually Colin might be getting more into this, but I think in general, I just wanted to share that my thought is I like the idea of having to go through the process of the MDS or the new construction based on what we've been talking about. I could see, just based on a need, if funding becomes a barrier, that there's other avenues to address that, because I think one of the comments was sidewalks, they may not exist currently, but they might be important to the project, which I think we've outlined in a lot of the development code changes of what things are critical for this type of use. And so maybe there's other avenues that are not necessarily directly the development code, but are ways to sort of marry those things together.
Okay, thanks. I see Scott. Sorry if I'm missing somebody.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the sidewalk thing, because it's not just sidewalks that don't exist that need to be put in. I've worked on projects where the sidewalk, there is a current sidewalk and it's curb tight. And a lot of times, you know, the city will say, well, as long as it meets the PROAG standards, you can keep it and we won't force you to move it property tight. The issue is sidewalks have to be sloped slightly to create runoff so that water doesn't pool up and freeze and create a hazard, but it also has to meet cross slope requirements for accessibility. And the distance between those two, I guess, angles is it's almost imaginary. A sidewalk could meet code in the wintertime and not in the summertime because of upheaval of the land or whatever. And what often happens is, usually, even if it's a brand new sidewalk, only a few years old, it won't meet those cross slope requirements. And then it causes a developer to have to dig those up or redo them. And if I see the third bullet point, Colin, that you went over afterwards, those are the kind of things that the city would allow, you know, existing sidewalk that might be curb tight, that's not property tight, it maybe doesn't meet the standards, but it basically meets the intent and it's not severely dangerous to use. I could see that as a viable option. The problem with sidewalks, and this gets into the weeds a little bit, but they're almost always in violation and there's almost nothing you could do to make them comply with the accessibility requirements, especially when you have to shed the water and just the distances between those slopes.
Yeah, that's a good point, Scott. And I will say there is internal discussion going on between our engineering staff and our planning staff, because it was never the intent during the creation of the minimum development standards to, you know, perfect the site to, you know, to that, you know, that 1 week where it meets all of the standards and then not. It's more of, at least for the MDS, it was always the intent to just, is the facility there? It's not whether it meets the precise engineering requirements. I will say that, you know, there are instances where a sidewalk has completely failed for whatever reason, upheaval, or it's just been, you know, broken up by perhaps trucks driving on it or something like that, where they need some panels replaced. But for the MDS, it's never been the intent to completely rebuild what would otherwise, you know, in a layperson's eyes, be like, well, that sidewalk looks fine to me. And then the comment before that was a good segue into the first bullet under the options. And I've talked about this with the group in the past. We have a waiver to public improvement standards in the code already, but and the developments can apply for that if there's a reason that they can't meet the public improvement standards that would otherwise be required by the code. And it's set up, there's 10 or 11 sort of reasons, like it's, you know, there's not enough right of way, or there's a rock outcropping, or there's something physical that's preventing it from happening. And what we discussed as a staff as an option would be to enhance or add to that criteria for granting one of these waivers to be specific to a shelter use, and allow for perhaps a financial hardship to be a reason to grant that. And there's various ways that we could justify that. Either it's permanent, or we delay it and we defer it for a number of years or something like that. But that's an option. And that would allow us to analyze these things on a case-by-case basis and not trying to predict all of the potential issues that we're going to run into during the crafting of this code. And I'll stop there and let others jump in or if there's questions.
Yeah, Barb, I see.
Thank you. Colin, so how about a specific example with the Veterans Village? It was brand new on a bare lot. So minimum development standards would have applied. In that case, it meant off-site improvements, but we managed to do kind of exactly what you said. Sidewalks, if I'm not mistaken, were built, but no, we did not end up having to do that off-site improvement to a nearby street. Can you tell me how did that happen?
Yeah. So first off, if it had come in under the development code, it would have been a new use on the new site. So MDS on a site that had not been previously developed. So MDS wouldn't apply, it would have been site plan review. And I think everybody remembers that there was that cul-de-sac that just ended at the northern portion of the property, and there's a right-of-way that under our code, it would have pointed to, well, that we wouldn't consider that an offsite, that would be a frontage improvement. But the direct reading of the code would say push the street through. That's where a waiver like this for a financial hardship could be a potential relief from that. Now, we didn't have to get into any of that because if you'll recall, there was the state House bill and they changed the numbers a number of times, and I can't remember what it eventually ended up with was. But that House bill preempted the city from applying any zoning regulations to the siting of that. So I didn't really get involved. There were some building code issues that needed to be resolved. There needed to be some findings related to access to transportation facilities. But it basically boiled down to meeting the building code requirements. I think they extended sewer and water and electrical, and then there were some structural building code things, but that was it. We didn't get into any assessment of public infrastructure extensions because a lot of that, actually all of that flows through the development code, which was intentionally not part of that process.
Okay, so they were exempt because of a House bill. So we didn't need the waiver, which
Right.
is the first bullet in the option, but we think that projects coming forward, that House bill will not apply to them and they may need a new waiver.
So the House bill that's in effect right now, Barb, for that super siting is where you could site a shelter without going through the development code process, expires July 1 of next year. So there's still the one that Veterans Village applied under expired, but there's a new one, which is why nobody can remember the numbers. But the new one for super siting expires July 1. So there is still a window for shelters to apply if they have a site and they have the funding to develop under the House bill. And then these provisions apply, when adopted and to uses after that House bill expires. And so the question is there an additional waiver standard that this committee wants to recommend to be added for these uses, or is there a different way to address public improvement standards? And one of the things to note in the list is, for the Veterans Village site example, stick with that one. If the House bill didn't exist and going through site plan review would have required building of the street, if they want to be a permanent use there or a long-term use there, going through the development code is appropriate. We also did, City Council passed the safe parking code, which allows temporary uses of 1 year at a time for parking of small vehicles or tents. And that's not a land use decision, and so wouldn't require improvement. So there are some options for short-term uses. Could be the temporary shelter code under the development code, or these safe parking and outdoor temporary accommodations that are under the municipal code, which were also kind of uses expanded under recent state legislative bills. The same bill that has the superseding provisions also allowed those sort of temporary transitional options. There's a lot of names. My point is there's an option in our code for a short 1 year authorization for a safe parking type use. So, the point for operators of shelters and developers is there may be another option if the development code might require construction of a road, right? There may be other options to look at. Or is there a waiver standard we want to add to the code to add yet another option?
Thank you so much for clarifying that. Since my mic is still on, I will say, yes, we need a new waiver standard exempting certain uses, and or we should exempt outdoor shelters on vacant land from certain public improvement standards. I would ask staff, are those exclusive? If we do one, do we not need to do the other? And then is one more straightforward or easier than the other of those 2 bullet points?
Well,
That's
let
a
me
good
answer
question.
that before we answer the other questions with the hands raised, just so I can. Now, Elizabeth did a good job. She jumped into the second bullet, which is somewhat, it's sort of like what the House bill did, but we could do it locally, and that would be to exempt outdoor shelters from certain public improvements. Like, do we say you have to put a sidewalk in, but not the street, if it's site plan review? Or do as Elizabeth said, they can be there for a year under our existing overnight accommodations, but it's up for 1 year and you can limit it to 6 vehicles. So that would be like step 1, or just exempting maybe several improvements, but not others. And then the third bullet is if the sounding board doesn't want any improvements for conversion of a use for new or for new construction, to just exempt everything. So it's kind of an open selection of how far we want to go, and it's related to what I talked about earlier. It's trying to hit that sweet spot about providing what these folks need to interact, to get in and off of the site safely and have a relatively easy and dignified way to access where they're living. So I think we need to have some discussion about how far we want to go on these. And now, Barb, to answer your question about are they cumulative or are they exclusive, I think they could be cumulative. It just sort of depends on exactly how far we want to go. To say, I mean, if everything's exempt, then you wouldn't want to have the waiver standard. But if it's something more in the middle, then we probably want to consider, well, would there ever be an instance where we won't want to waive that particular requirement? And if so, then you'd want to have that one in there as well. So it really it's in the details of what we come down with in the end about where everything would align or end up in the code.
Thank you. That really helps.
Kathy?
Yeah, this is more of a question. It's very confusing, and I would imagine somebody applying to do a shelter might be completely baffled by all of this. And I'm wondering if we're intending to create sort of an ombudsman position or a key planner at the planning department that's tasked with helping and these kinds of applications get through the process and find the most expeditious way to do so. Because whatever we agree with, it seems like there are going to be hoops to jump through, and knowing which is the best route to take or to ask for which exemption or see if there needs to be an agreement is going to be confusing. And we really need to have someone tasked with helping an applicant get through the process to do this. And so I'm just wondering, Colin, if that's possible at the planning department, or if there's a goal to have someone like that be available should something like this come through. I think would be very helpful, depending on, if we say everything's exempt, then maybe it doesn't matter. But anything short of that, it seems like there's going to need to be some hand holding.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it's actually something that we are currently doing. Lynn McConnell typically is the initial point of contact for people interested in doing these types of developments, for lack of a better word, facilities. And then what we in the planning division have done is prioritized, or at least assigned, one planner to be the main contact for Lynn. And that plan, it's Karen Swenson. I think some of you have worked with Karen in the past, but she is up to speed on quite a bit of this, and she is usually available to vet proposals right, as soon as they're coming in, and work with the potential provider on getting through the system. It's right now we're dealing with the existing system and then the House bills, but that I would consider Karen to be the go-to person, and I would continue that assignment for her to be the lead on that.
That's perfect. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Eric.
Yeah, just to kind of echo the need for this, the service road connection would have cost us perhaps $1 million to move a 17-foot butte. I don't know how many tons of rock that would have been, but our whole project cost $700,000, and the connecting the service road would not have added any value. So I think everybody saw that, and good thing that 4212 mitigated the need for that. But I think the waiver and the exemptions that we're talking about, are just good common sense solutions to say, gosh, connecting a road, spending $1 to $2 million, which adds zero value to the houseless need in our community. We should probably not have to have that as a requirement. And I guess I would say without this process, which is going to, it's gone on July 1st when the new bill expires, we just wouldn't have done our project. It just would have been too cost prohibitive. We would have been back, looking for new land, outside UGB, which is very different requirements with the county. And so, ultimately the waiver gives, the difference between reality and not reality. We did something because of the waiver process, even though it wasn't needed. The mitigation of that requirement is essentially what the new waiver would do. And, I don't think that it needs to be a temporary, it's case by case. I think having a common sense solution that city staff can look at and say, okay, this is something that should happen in 2 years. This is something that never needs to happen. I think giving the city staff the tools to make good common sense decisions is key. And I think both of these are good ideas. Thank you.
Okay, Hans, I see your hand up, and then what I'm thinking is we can go through these last two slides and get your recommendations on those, and then start to talk about other recommendations. So
thanks, Susanna.
yeah.
I just want to add on to, I guess, what Colin said and what Eric said. I think there is a sweet spot here. As much as being a recovering engineer, as much as I'd love to have everything clear and objective, I think the idea of a common sense judgment call and some latitude is probably important. I am reacting a little bit to some of the comments I saw from the respondents about a double standard. And we just have to accept the fact that when we try to make accommodations to facilitate some of these solutions, there probably will have to be a double standard. So finding, as Colin described, that sweet spot where we facilitate something, we don't make it an impossible lift, but at the same time, we respect that we have reasons that we have public improvement standards, and they're there for good reason. And so that balance that Eric spoke to and Colin spoke to, I think is really where we want to, or I would hope that we would sort of center up and find that good balance so that we're accomplishing our goals, but not making the argument that there are no standards for these things, because clearly we intend to have standards to some extent.
Okay, does anyone have anything else on this? Scott?
Yeah, sorry, I hate to bring it back to sidewalks again, but we do have I believe, for ADUs, we don't have a sidewalk requirement, correct?
That's correct. That was removed a couple years ago.
Yeah, and I remember some of the reasons were, or I remember someone came before the planning commission, and one of the, as a kind of a reason was they lived on a corner lot, and if they had to change their sidewalk, they had to bring it again curb tight, or sorry, property tight, and there was terrain and rock in the way, and they were looking at you know, whatever it was, $50,000, $60,000 to be able to put that sidewalk in and bring it up to standards. And that was one of the reasons, you know, those are the type of reasons why I believe that was exempted from ADUs, because of what was being built. It seemed like that was kind of a requirement that was too burdensome on something that was as small as the ADU. And you know how Eric said that some of these projects they're low budget, and you know, even for a small corner property, having a $40,000 price tag just to bring the sidewalk up to standards seems like it's quite a lot. And I mean, you know, we all want sidewalks and the ability to use them, and for them to be safe, but just the specific requirements on a lot of these sidewalks are they're fairly excessive from a common sense point of view, and can create like a pretty large financial barrier to some of these and represent a significant portion of the project.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's been a progression of trying to sort of eliminate requirements for ADUs. You know, gosh, 6-7 years ago, they had required a conditional use permit in the residential zones. We removed that, and then there was the sidewalks, and then the state has stepped in and removed, can't require off-street parking any longer for them. So that's certainly been an evolution into where we're regulating the ADUs now. I will say, but that's a good example of what I'm talking about when you're trying to craft regulations, but you don't know how they're going to affect a particular site. Like there are some sites that have 40 feet of frontage, completely flat, you probably pop a sidewalk in relatively quickly, and probably wouldn't on the scheme of things while they're mobilized and doing construction, wouldn't be that impactful on the development. But as you said, if it's a corner lot and there's a rock outcropping they've got to grapple with, that's a completely different set of facts that owner's got to deal with. And that's why we did set up the waiver to public improvement standards with a list of 10 different criteria. Some of them are, most of them, they're sort of physical constraints that we rely upon. So that's just an illustration of how things in the field can be completely different, even though you're applying the same code to them.
Okay, am I muted? No, okay. Oh, how does everyone feel about a quick break? 5 minutes? Okay, all right. Let's and then we'll start going through what we want to make recommendations on. Okay, see you back here in, I don't know what time it is, 11:07. Okay.
Thanks for the break, Susanna. I needed it.
What? Oh, I'm on my headphones. Whoops.
Oh, sorry. I just said thanks for the break. I needed the stretching.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, you guys, you have long meetings. 3 hours is nothing.
That's true. It's harder in the beginning of the day, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably. Yeah. Okay. Let me see. Okay. Hope people will come back. All right. I think Hans dropped off, but Sean will do the NLA recommendations. So.
I heard that, and I thought I should give you some feedback.
Okay.
Having been on this committee for all of 2 hours now, I was hoping that Hans would give some pretty good insight for me on which way, if I had to vote, I should be leaning. So hopefully he does come back.
I know he had a hard stop at 11. So yeah. I don't have his number to text him or anything.
I mean, I'm very opinionated.
Yeah.
But I don't think that my opinions should be weighed in at this point with my limited involvement. I don't think it's democratic.
That's a good point.
So hopefully he comes back.
Yeah, I don't know that he will come back. And Elizabeth, I'm not sure if she's back on.
Yeah, I'm
Oh,
here.
there you are. Okay.
Yeah. So I think,
there you are.
Hans gave a couple bits of feedback in the discussion that I think will be part of the discussion moving forward about what is the final recommendation. And then Sean, it's, you've been appointed to the seat on this committee. And so it would be up to you to vote in the end, or if you wanted to abstain because of however you feel about participating in the process and participating in the discussion, that's up to you and that's available to you if you feel that's more appropriate for you to abstain from the final vote and just participate in the discussion, you can do that. But you are a member of the sounding board and can vote on the final recommendation.
Okay.
Okay, is everyone, like Stacy's here. Okay, Kathy. All right, I think what I'm gonna do now is go back to share screen, and I've kind of been making a tally of the different recommendations, and then we can add to it and then get your feedback and then go through each of those. Does that sound like a good plan? Or topics of like areas you want to make recommendations in, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So let me. Okay, so we've got the code enforcement recommendations for temporary shelters. We had the recommendation that within a residential zoning district, a temporary shelter has to be associated with an institutional or public use. And I guess the question is, if you wanted to go that way, is it all residential zoning districts? Like, are the higher density ones exempt from that? Or would you like to just do all of them? And then with the hardship shelters, look at the time limit recommendations. And then with this public improvement standards, which is what we just discussed, do you want to recommend a new waiver standard based on shelter type and financial hardship? Do you want to exempt the new outdoor shelters from the public improvement standards at all? And then I guess the question is, what about all shelters? And I think staff would lean towards the group shelter or the multi-room shelter. If that's a new facility, you're going to be putting stress on the system, and it should go through the normal channels. But an outdoor shelter is a little bit different, and those are maybe in effect kind of temporary. They might go away in 2 years. There probably is no foundation. So it's a different animal. So those are the things we wanted to get your guidance on. And I see a few hands up. So Sean.
It's more of a question, but based off of the feedback from the people that did provide feedback, why are the temporary shelters and the hardship shelters, why are the rules not the same? Why are we not requiring some institutional or involvement in the hardship shelters?
Yeah, it's just a little bit of a different animal. I mean, the hardship shelter is the concept of the RV in the driveway or on somebody's property. And we do, right now, we authorize that a little bit. It's a little bit different, but through something called a medical hardship, where you have to provide a doctor's verification. It's good for a year. And it's not an RV, it's like a separate manufactured home can provide shelter for somebody going through medical hardship for a year. During the wildfires of 2020, we did authorize people through the emergency order to be able to have people housed temporarily in an RV, either from rebuilding a home or if a family member needed a place to stay, we authorized that. We see it happening anyway all over town in some areas. And we get calls from people who might have a relative, they might live on a larger lot out east or something, have an RV there anyway, and they want to house somebody for a temporary period. Other peer cities are doing it, and it's all new, so we don't have like a lot of things to look towards, but we thought it would be just one of the tools in the toolbox to give somebody the ability to house somebody that was houseless for a temporary period of time. The temporary shelter is kind of like an umbrella, and the hardship shelter fits under that. The temporary shelter is much different. It's more of a gym wants to open up, the Bend Church wants to open up, host people for the day to get day services, get out of the cold, or night, get out of the smoke, air conditioning. It doesn't even have to be houseless people. It's, elderly people, they don't have air. A lot of people don't have air conditioning here. And it's just the ability to provide, a safe place to go when the environment's not so great. So, Kathy, does that make sense, Sean?
Yep.
Okay. Kathy, did you have any more input?
Well, I wanted to talk about the hardship shelter and the time recommendations. Was there a slide that was specifically addressing what changes might happen on that, or is that just kind of an open for discussion? It seemed to me that that was one area where we could respond to a lot of the public input that would still allow that as an option, but is more respectful, as Barb pointed out. This is something that could be pretty much next door to anybody in town. And so, although I will say there are some HOAs that have CC&Rs that do not allow RV parking in their driveways. And I'm not sure that this change would have any effect on those neighborhoods. I would be open to looking at a shorter initial time, like 6 months as opposed to a year, and then have the ability to renew in more of a 6-month increment than a year increment, if other people in the committee are open to that. I just want to put it out there that I could see how that could be a good faith response on our part to some of the concerns that have been raised by the community. But I didn't know if you as staff had put together any kind of revised recommendations or not. So I just wanted us to have a chance to at least discuss this item.
Yeah, that's great. I hadn't put together like a bunch of recommendations. I thought we'd talk through them and then I'll kind of put them up and then you can vote on them all at once. But maybe we should talk now. Elizabeth, do you want to chime in? No, okay. We can talk right now about that recommendation. So how do folks feel about reducing the time? Right now we've got a year and the ability to renew that permit 2 additional times, which in effect, people felt like the way it was written, at least a lot of the comments we received, that was too long. That in effect gives people 3 years. So do folks do you want to vote on 6 months and then they can renew it for an additional 6 months? I guess Councilor Perkins, how do you want to do this?
I'm not sure if the Liz would have to jump in and if we could do that, but yeah, I mean, I'm that might be, I thought Kathy's point was really important. And I think the 6 months might alleviate some fears about this being a long-term. I guess the next question would be, if they're then just renewing it for another 6 months, then they just renew it for another 6 months, or how many renewals of the 6 months do we do?
So as far as the process question, I think we're at the point where you guys can discuss and sort of, if there's a coalescing around an option. I think how we've been doing this in the past is sort of a head nod, thumbs up as you've worked through a discussion. Everybody's kind of reached consensus on a recommendation, and then we would add that to the code provisions for your final recommendation at the end of the next hour. So no need to do a formal vote, I think, on any of these. If you can, as has been the case for the rest of our meetings, kind of have a discussion and reach a consensus together. In the proposed code as drafted, there's the initial year and then 2 extensions. So I think a point of clarification would be are you talking about a 6-month initial permit and then 2 6-month extensions, or something different? And however you want to craft this, these are your recommendations. You can work that out through a conversation.
Elizabeth, thank you. That is what I was thinking. 1 6 month and then 2 6 months. The idea being that this is to try to help somebody in an emergency situation get on their feet and go to another permanent solution rather than a permanent shelter on somebody's driveway. So that would be my proposal, but I'm open to discussion on it for sure.
Can I bring up one additional point? This is Stacy. I think Kathy is bringing up a great point. My only concern is the paperwork issue, but the other bigger concern is if we were to connect with someone when they move into this situation and get them onto our coordinated entry list. My concern is that we're looking at 2 to 3 years of a wait time to actually access affordable housing. So that's a little bit of a concern. Do we then get them there? They have a safe place for 1.5 years, and then we're exiting them back out into the street. Have we really helped them? And so I think the way the system is, I just wonder if we need to consider that. The other thing, and I apologize, I should know this, I think one thing that would also put people's minds at ease is if there was some kind of number so that that there's only going to be one of these, units being able to be on your property, and that all of a sudden your neighbor's not going to have 5, RVs with people. And I don't remember if we clarified a number.
Yep, Stacy, that's a great point. And looking at the draft code, there is a maximum of 1 per lot or parcel of the hardship shelters. So that answers that question.
Yeah, so additional input on changing the timing, Brianna, Barb, I don't know who was first, but yeah, just discuss. Eric, I see you too.
I'll quickly go. So one, I like that Stacey just added that because I think that's a critical piece, and I don't know if there's a way to tie in, like right now it's 2 years because, it seems redundant to make it 6 months and then have to reapply 4 times in order to just meet what our current constraints are. But could you then say in 2025 2025, we will reevaluate with the intent to reduce to 6 months because more housing will be available. I don't know if that makes sense. But the other thing that I wanted to, when I thought of the hardship shelter and how that might be used, if a site was identified and somebody set it up to be a hardship shelter, I also thought they could have different tenants in it. So if they're really good at it, it works really well for them and they're managing it, why couldn't somebody transition into a permanent supportive housing and somebody new that needed a hardship shelter then gets to be there? So the place itself is maintained for a longer duration, but they're different individuals. And so in my head, that's how I imagined it. But I understand that we're talking about this, like, it just seems like a lot of work to put it up for 6 months and then you never do it again. And if it was an enjoyable experience, you got to give back to the community, why not keep doing it? So.
And I can speak to how that is drafted. Sorry, Susanna, I can speak to how that's drafted right now, Brianna. And again, this sort of goes back to how I was answering Councilor Campbell's question earlier. This code is about the use, not necessarily the who is in the use. And so what this would do is, as drafted, we have permit to have the RV in the driveway for up to a year or up to 6 months, and then the extensions. Who is in and out of that use is not governed by the code, right? Just the presence of that RV and the permission under the code to have someone or people in that RV. So I think as drafted, it wouldn't prohibit different people from using the RV if someone, did find other health shelter within the time the use is permitted. But as drafted, and as part of your discussions, when we were looking at this code, there is a 180-day or a 6-month gap. So once your permit ends and you've exhausted all renewals, if you wanted to renew, you couldn't get another permit within 180 days for a hardship shelter. And if I recall the discussion, it's because this is drafted to be a temporary use and not a permanent use of a lot or parcel, that was why put the time constraints on it and then require a gap. If somebody's really good at running hardship shelters, maybe they can find another lot and open an outdoor shelter, right? And go through the code process of what would be required to have a permanent use. But because this is drafted to be a temporary use, you guys put in that pause.
Yeah, and I think the pause, and I think what you said makes a lot of sense, and that's probably why I interpreted it that way, is that I like the idea of a longer one because it could be different individuals, but then having the pause, so maybe it's not a forever thing. Maybe then they do look at having the ability to have more. So I think, to me, that still aligns with what I was hoping it would be, but without changing it or shortening the duration, but that's just my opinion.
Okay, Eric?
Yeah, I support the temporary use in this version, and 6 months with 3 renewals would be my proposal. You don't have to change it, but that's just my input. That's a total of 2 years. We had a total of 3 years with 1 year initially and 2 renewals. So that's just my minor change.
Barb, you have your hand up.
I agree. Temporary shelter would be something like a church opening their doors, either in the winter because it's hot or because it's smoke. And I don't really see that one lasting for a long sustained period of time. The hardship shelters, on the other hand, I think we want there to be enough time for someone to actually get on their feet. And thank you, Stacy, for telling us how long it takes to get into affordable housing. So I think what Eric said is a good compromise. 6 months with 3 renewals, that means possibly 2 years. And then I also agree that a break is a good thing, that after that period of time, there will be some time where nobody's in an RV and the neighbors just get a break. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sean?
So again, a clarification on the hardship shelters. Can I get a permit to put one? Can somebody get a permit to put one on a city street in front of their home?
Mhm.
It has to be
No.
off. It has to be on your property.
Yeah. Yep. Has to be on your property and you have to authorize it. It was clear from some of the comments we got that people thought we were going to the city was going to identify random lots and we were going to go buy a bunch of RVs and put them on people's lots without their permission. But we weren't, I mean, there's no way we would even think of doing that, So no, this is like the property owner has to authorize it. They have to do the permitting and they have to be responsible for the the activity that's going on their property, just like anything else. So.
And again, I apologize, this might already have been answered, but who ensures the safety and sanitation side of things?
The property owner is responsible for all of it. Mm-hmm.
So if they aren't doing a good job, how is that corrected?
Yeah, we can, that was that language that we wanted to add to the hardship and the temporary shelters that we can revoke their permit, immediate revocation. So it would go to code enforcement, like a usual one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the idea was, because you haven't been here also, is that, the permit would be a pretty easy thing to get, but you'd be given like a sticker to put on the RV and it would be visible from the right of way. So people would know that it was a permitted use. You can't charge a fee. You can't use it for a short-term rental. And that's all in the draft code. So.
And in the conversations today, I've heard contradictory answers to the same question. Mm-hmm. Some HOAs don't allow RVs in the driveways, either in their CC&Rs or in their bylaws. Does the city code override that?
So not typically, Sean, no. So if a CC&R prohibits a use that is otherwise allowed by the city code wouldn't automatically override, no.
Okay.
So these would mostly be in areas where there aren't CC&Rs or HOAs. So unless the HOAs don't speak to it, in some way, but it's likely that they do. So.
Okay.
I think it's just semantics, but I think that the term hardship shelter is kind of confusing. And I worry that the public, their knee-jerk reaction will be, we don't want a shelter, when in reality, it's really not a shelter. I don't know if there's anything we can do about thinking about another way to categorize or to name this so that it really describes more. Because when I hear that, I think of lots of people and vehicles parked on a parking lot versus what we're actually talking about. So I don't know if there's any other name for it.
Like housing, hardship housing, house.
Maybe we just call it RV, RV shelter. I mean, because that's what it's going to be, right? I mean, it's not going to be a mobile home put on a driveway. It's going to be an RV. So maybe that would be a clarifying thing to say, emergency RV shelter or something.
You get on
board. I like that. I like the housing though. I think that's a good point. Is there's a difference possibly people's reactions to shelter or housing.
Emergency RV housing. I don't know. I think Kathy, that we're onto something here.
Yeah.
And for clarification, a hardship shelter can be a manufactured dwelling, manufactured home, structure, mobile home, or RV.
Oh, so then I guess I probably would default to housing just because of all of the discussion around like Hunnell. If somebody hears RV, even though I like my RV a lot, I don't know that the general public will be as receptive to what that might be. I don't know if we could use, yeah.
So the previous use in the temporary use code was the medical hardship housing. So would hardship housing kind of bridge the gap here? You're onto something there.
Go back to what you already did. Yeah, do that.
Hardship housing.
And I wanted to bring up just a clarification on the whole CC&Rs, that if CC&Rs are already in existence, then this type of hardship housing would not be available, but new CCNRs would be prohibited from denying these, right?
Not necessarily, Scott.
Oh, really? Okay, because usually when we've been dealing with these development code updates, it's whatever HOAs say at the time of adoption can be maintained, but they're unable to add additional restrictions.
So there was a House bill recently where the state legislature said newly adopted or revised CCNRs couldn't in the future prohibit, I think it was ADUs, but I'm not totally sure exactly what the legislature said. So there is some limitation that has been put on what new CCNRs could prohibit, but this code wouldn't necessarily prohibit these from being prohibited by CCNRs in the future. And there has been ADA litigation under the Americans with Disability Act specifically about RVs parking in driveways prohibited by CCNRs. So, it's not like any other technical legal question. There's not necessarily a cut and dry, black and white, absolutely yes or absolutely no answer, but generally CCNRs could prohibit this type of use even when it would be allowed by code.
Sean, you've had your hand up.
That's something that Hans said before he logged off. And I don't know if I can ask this question of this group, but I'm going to. Is there anybody on here that does not live in an HOA that restricts this? I personally do live in okay. So there's at least 1, 2, 3. Okay. So
I don't know if I count, but I yeah.
Okay. So there's a significant number that don't live in HOAs. Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay, so what I think I heard was reduce it to 6 months with the opportunity to renew 3 times and then change the name to hardship housing. I'm seeing a lot of head nods. Okay. Okay, and this is not the final vote, so we'll come back to it and get the official tally. So the public improvement standards, do you folks have feelings about that? Should we do a new waiver standard based on the shelter type and, adding a waiver specific to shelters and then additional, financial hardship? Should we exempt the new outdoor shelters from the public improvement standards? And then I don't think we need to ask about what about all shelters, because I think it's just a case by case basis. If we're going to have some new development like the Bethlehem Inn come in, they're going to have impacts and we're going to want improvements just to support that. Okay, I think Scott was first and then Kathy.
Yeah, I'm in favor of the new waiver standard based on shelter type and financial hardship. I just think that these are kind of wildly different development types, and I think that they could be addressed more specifically to what they are. And this also maybe gives a little more time for the city to kind of look into that before it goes to planning commission. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, Kathy?
I actually would be supportive of both because I think we are going to see within the next few months some outdoor shelters being, before the snow starts falling or, and we have to act quickly. So I would support both options here.
Folks generally support both options. Maybe you could give me the thumbs up.
I did just want to speak to the timing, since Kathy, you brought that up. We've said that the proposed code here would go to the planning commission in January and then be scheduled for city council, and it wouldn't be in effect for 30 days after city council adoption. So nothing here would be in effect unless we have a really dry winter before snow flies this winter. The effective date would not be until after city council acts sometime later in the winter after planning commission.
But we do have House Bill 2006 super citing that's good through next, June 30th. So any shelters could go in under that right now. Kathy? Oh, no.
No, I just, thank you for the clarification on that. Yeah, the intention is that when these come forward, that we be able to be nimble and act quickly on them. And the kind of, we'll have other requirements for them. We have the parking for them and so forth, that I just don't see that we need to do the standard process on this type of housing. So thank you.
Okay, so it seems like people want both of those. So when we get down to recommendations, we'll make one specific to both of those. And then what about additional topics? So one that kind of stands out in my mind are the maximum number of rooms in each zoning district for multi-room shelters. And then the parking standards for all of them. So, not Kathy?
Yeah, I don't recommend reducing any of the numbers. I think Hans made a good point that people tend to look at a worst case scenario. It's never going to be that. And we have the ability to make changes moving forward if we see there are issues that are coming up. Same thing with the parking. We did talk to our members of this board that are actually serving this population to determine what would make the most sense in terms of parking, and that we have an insight on that the general public does not. And I think that, you know, as long as we're able to make adjustments moving forward, depending on what happens on the ground, I think we're good. I would like to just stick with what we've proposed.
Anyone else have input on that?
I would agree.
Yeah, same here. I think we have enough time, and the city has shown that they're willing to go back and revisit things if there's issues that arise. There was a lot of dire prognostications of what's going to happen when these would go through, and I think that there's kind of a full spectrum of what people think is going to be a result of these, and I think it'd be best to be fine-tuned maybe at a later date, but for right now I think I'm fine with it.
On all shelter types, no changes. Okay, was there anything else that stood out to you that we should be revisiting? No. Okay. All right. Okay. So now I guess we'll do a vote on recommendations, and Kayla had to leave and go to a different meeting. So even though we don't normally do this, I'm going to do like a roll call vote so I can make sure I get the right tally, and I'll put it on the screen. Is that okay, Elizabeth? I'm not violating anything. Okay. All right. And I'm just going to go in order of how you're coming up on my squares. Sean McFadden, did you want to vote on the code recommendations, or do you want to wait till the end?
Susanna, do we need an actual motion?
Oh, maybe we do. Yeah. Okay, go for it.
I move to accept the code changes with the changes that we have discussed. I'm trying to figure out how to say this easily, right?
I'll be a second.
Okay, so why don't Sean, since you're new, I'll start with Kathy. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Brianna.
Yes.
Oops, spelling wrong. Scott.
Yes.
Okay. Counselor Perkins.
Yes.
And Barb Campbell, Counselor Campbell.
Yes.
Okay. Eric.
Yes.
And Stacy.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else? And Sean.
No, due to the hardship shelters.
Okay. And is that because, can I ask you, is that because you don't think they're a good idea at all, or would there be modifications that we could make to this where you might be okay with them? And I'm just more curious than anything else.
Yeah, based on my limited experience, and most of that comes from reading the responses, I don't think the community supports it. It won't impact me personally. I live in a community that you couldn't do it if you wanted to for lots of reasons. The driveways aren't big enough for starters, and they're CC&Rs. But based on the feedback from the survey, I'm uncomfortable supporting the hardship shelters. Everything else, I don't have enough information to really weigh in on.
Yeah, okay. Great. That's good information. And over the next couple months, I'm going to try and, before we go to Planning Commission, look at other places that have done this beyond Portland, and Eugene's done it too, but I don't think Medford has and stuff, but I'll look at other places and see if we can come back to Planning Commission with some better information on the impacts and how many that we've seen of these and things like that. So, yeah. Okay.
Can I just add one thing to the hardship, just to kind of consider? In other areas that I've looked at, when there is a plan in place like this, it actually limits the place, what do I want to say, the spaces, because people now have to get a permit and there are consequences if you just have people live on your property in an RV or trailer, and people are doing it. And they're doing it frequently. So I think in some ways it actually would protect those neighborhoods that are doing it without the proper permits or permissions, and give us a little bit more I don't want to say control, but a little bit more kind of co-creating a plan for folks. So just wanted to add that in just my experience.
Yeah, that's great. We got that in some comments as well. So, yeah. Okay, let me stop sharing then. Where am I? Okay, great. Well, is there anything else we need to talk about? We'll be going to Planning Commission on the 10th of January for a work session, and then the public hearing is January 24th. And yeah, we'll just keep hitting the streets with this stuff and trying to get feedback before the Planning Commission meeting. So,
Santa,
yeah.
Sometimes when we have recommendations coming from a committee going to Planning Commission or Council, we have a representative from the committee come and share the perspective of the committee and what the vote was and why the votes went the way they did, or other information. Did you want to seek volunteers for that for the work session and Planning Commission?
I was just going to ask that.
I know, Scott, you'll be there.
Yeah, I'll be there. But no, I think it's really important because you know, as we've been going through a lot of these meetings and had lots of discussion, it is going to be relatively, even though we did talk about it once before the Planning Commission, I think it's really helpful to have at least one, hopefully more of you be available for the work session too, because you know, a lot of times there's questions from planning commissioners, and having people who are, you know, experienced in service providers or development of this type of property, these type of developments, I think is really helpful. So.
Yeah, so I'll be communicating with you all about the times and stuff like that. Yeah, Kathy, I saw your hand up, and Barb.
Yeah, I just want to thank the city manager for creating this sounding board, how important it is to hear from all of us. We have a really broad perspective on the issue and represent different constituencies and different life experiences that we bring to this. And it's so important to get all those different points of view to come up with the best solutions. And the fact that the city works this way and draws on the expertise of the community is really commendable and is unusual, frankly. in my experience in other cities. So I just want to thank everyone for participating and thank the city manager for inviting us to give our input, and then also to the 2 city councilors on this for all your hard work. I know it's a lot of committees and work to sit on, but this is a super, super important issue. And I think that Oregon basically is leading the way for the rest of the country and how we're dealing with a lot of these issues, and having this kind of community input and expertise is critical to make the right decisions. And then also the fact that the city is willing to make changes moving forward. If we see something's not working or we need to revise it, improve it, whatever, you're open to doing it. It's not cast in stone. And I think that that's super important to acknowledge. And anyway, I just wanted to thank everyone involved.
Great, thank you. Barb?
Thank you. Ditto on the thanks to everyone. I was going to throw in an additional thanks to Sean McFadden. Sean, thank you so much. This is your first meeting. You got tossed in here and you asked, I think, one of the very most important questions of all, which is, would these changes actually affect anyone on this committee? That is such a good question. That is fundamental to representative government. Is, are there people making these decisions that are in fact affected by the decisions they make? So thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here today. And that was such a good question, John. Thanks.
Megan.
Agreed, Sean. I just want to say, as a very, very new counselor, when we started this process, now I'm just kind of a new counselor. I just want to say thank you for making this such a positive experience. I've learned so much from all of you. And like Kathy said, I mean, just seeing all of these different perspectives come together and be able to vote on this today. It's just been an absolute pleasure. So thank you all.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for dedicating your time, especially folks that, this is not the greatest time of day to meet. Usually our meetings are 2 hours, so that's a little better, but this was a long one. So thanks for hanging in there and all the technology challenges and all that kind of stuff, and for all of your input. It made it really a great experience for staff too. So, and I will be sending out a Zoom invite for like a 5-minute meeting to go through the minutes from this meeting and then the last meeting. So, and and I'll keep in touch about future meetings and things like that. So anyway, anyone else before we close? Especially want to thank the service providers too, Stacy and Dana and Eric. So thanks so much for all you do. Okay. All right. Take care, guys. Thank you. Bye.